Arizona Territory, 1879. The first time he heard her laugh, Orion Tate was ankle-deep in horse manure, elbow-deep in stubborn mule hide, and about 2 seconds away from throwing his hat to the dirt. The sound hit him like a gust of spring wind through a storm-beaten canyon, sharp, bright, and full of life in a place that had not seen much of it lately. He turned his head slow, like the world had narrowed to that one sound. She stood on the porch of the boarding house across the street, sun catching in her wild brown curls, one hand pressed to her waist as she doubled over in laughter. A boy had just chased a chicken straight across the street and into an open bucket of laundry water. She looked like she had not laughed in years and now could not stop. Orion wiped his hands on his trousers and straightened. She was not from around here, he would have remembered. "Who is that?" he asked the stable hand beside him. "New girl from back east, showed up last week. Miss Josephine Langley. Folks say she got sent out here for baying too loud." "Too loud?" Orion frowned, watching as she wiped at her eyes and leaned against the porch rail. "Sent away for laughing, talking, arguing. One of those Boston types with opinions. Her uncle runs the telegraph office, took her in after her pa passed." Orion's gaze stayed on her. She looked so alive it ached. He had not even known he missed that kind of sound until now. "She gotta laugh like it means something," he murmured. The stable hand shrugged. "You want silence, go marry a cactus." "I do not want silence," Orion said, then turned back to the mule. "Not anymore." Josephine hated the heat, the dust, and the way people looked at her like she was too much. She hated how quiet the town was, how the women at the general store dropped their voices when she walked in. But worst of all, she hated how her uncle never looked at her. Not really. Just another obligation. She had only laughed that day because she forgot, just for a second, where she was. Now, every time she walked through town, she felt it. Eyes. Judging. Whispering. She had not meant to raise her voice at church last Sunday, it was just a question. But Reverend Miles had gone stiff and her uncle had apologized on her behalf. She sat on the porch that evening with her sewing in her lap, fingers still, mind running. "Miss Langley," a voice said from the street. She looked up and squinted through the fading light. A tall man stood there, hat in hand, his dark blonde hair ruffled by the breeze. He had the kind of face that looked carved by a life outdoors, sun-browned, strong lines, steady eyes. "Yes, I am Orion Tate. I run the ranch northwest of town." She nodded. "I have seen you at the stables." He stepped closer, hesitated, then said, "I heard you laugh the other day." Sounded like something good. That startled her. "You heard me?" "Yes, ma'am, I liked it." She blinked, unsure what to do with that. Most folks acted like her laugh was a sin. "Well," she said, a little breathless, "that is kind of you to say." He nodded. "You looked happy." Made me want to hear it again. She felt warmth rise in her chest. No one had ever said that to her. Not once. "You are a strange man, Mr. Tate," she said softly. "I get that a lot." Their eyes held for a moment too long. Then she looked away, heart thudding. The next week he showed up with apples. Said he had too many. The week after, it was a book of poetry his mother had left behind before she died. "I thought maybe you would like it," he said, handing it over without meeting her eyes. She opened it that night in bed and found a pressed flower between the pages. Every time she saw him, she felt less alone, but not everyone liked it. "She is not proper," one woman hissed behind her in the church pews. "Did you hear her laugh? Like a coyote in heat." Josephine stood and left before the sermon even started. She walked until her feet ached, tears hot on her cheeks. Orion found her by the river, shoes off, skirt trailing in the current. "They hate me," she said without turning. "They think I am loud and wrong and too much." He stepped up beside her, close enough she could feel the heat of him. "Then they are wrong," he said. You are not too much, they are too little. She let out a broken sound, half laugh, half sob. I do not know how to be quiet. Good, he said. I hope you never learn. She looked at him then, the way his jaw tightened, his eyes steady on hers. I do not want to go back, she whispered. You do not have to. He reached for her hand slow, like he did not want to spook her. She let him take it. And in that quiet moment, something shifted. Josephine started walking into town with her head higher. Orion came by more often, always with something in his hands, a jar of jam, a carved hair comb, a worn map of the mountains. He never asked for anything. Just sat with her, listened, and made her feel like her voice was worth something. One morning, she found a folded note tucked into the poetry book. You make the world feel louder in a good way. I never knew how quiet I had gotten until I heard you laugh. She pressed it to her chest and smiled. But not everyone was happy. Her uncle pulled her aside one evening. You are making a spectacle of yourself. I am talking to someone in the open air, she said flatly. He is not suitable. He is kind. He listens. He is a cowboy. He is better than every man I knew back east. He slapped the table. You will not ruin your name over some ranch hand. She stood. Then maybe I do not want your name anymore. 2 nights later, she packed her things. She was not waiting to be sent away again. This time she would choose. She walked out into the desert night, dress hem catching on sagebrush, heart pounding. When she reached Orion's ranch, he was on the porch, half asleep in a chair. I left, she said. He stood up fast. What? I had to. I cannot be quiet anymore. He stepped down, eyes searching hers. You came here. I did. He looked at her like she was a miracle. I have a room inside, he said. It is yours if you want it. I want you, she said, not just a roof. You. He took her face in his hands and kissed her like she was the only sound in the world. And for the first time in her life, she felt heard. The dawn after Josephine arrived at Orion's ranch broke warm and quiet, the sky painted in muted rose and burnt gold. She stood at the edge of the porch, arms folded around herself, watching a pair of doves pick through the dust for fallen seed. She hadn't slept much, not from regret, but because her thoughts wouldn't still. Behind her, the door creaked open. You're up early, Orion said, voice still rough with sleep. He moved carefully like he didn't want to crowd her. I couldn't stay in bed, she said. It felt too still. He leaned against the post beside her, bare forearms crossed. You're used to more noise. I'm used to waking up with a dozen things expected of me. She glanced at him. None of them mine. Orion didn't answer right away. The wind carried the scent of mesquite and horses. You can have quiet here, he said finally, but none of it will be empty. She looked toward the barn where the roof sagged slightly on the north end. A patch of fencing leaned at an angle near the pastures. There's plenty to do, she said. He followed her gaze. Some days the list's longer than the sun. I can help, she said. I can mend, cook, keep books. I even know how to ride, not side saddle. His mouth pulled into something close to a smile, a quiet warmth behind it. Then you'll fit right in. They didn't speak again until the chickens started up their morning racket. Josephine moved off the porch first, stepping barefoot through the packed earth toward the coop. Leave the eggs with the straw in them, Orion called after her. The hens sit uneasy if they don't see one there. She gave a nod without turning. He watched her gather the eggs with careful hands, sleeves rolled past her elbows, skirts tied back with a bit of twine. She moved like she didn't want to waste a single motion. By the time he'd split enough wood for the stove, she was in the kitchen, flour on her wrists, sleeves damp from the pump. He paused in the doorway. You always make biscuits before breakfast. I always make breakfast with biscuits, she said. He chuckled low in his throat. That's dangerous talk. She didn't glance up. Then you'd better get used to danger. After breakfast, she asked about the horses. He showed her the corral, let her run her hand down the neck of a red mare that tossed her head but didn't flinch. "She's green," he said. "I haven't had time to break her proper. She's wary, not wild." Josephine looked the mare in the eye. "I know the difference." That night after supper, they sat on the porch, the hush between them easy. Josephine leaned back in the rocker, legs tucked beneath her, watching the moon rise over the hills. Orion sat on the steps, whittling a bit of pine into something shapeless. "When I arrived last week," she said slowly, "you didn't ask what I'd done to get sent here. I figured it wasn't the kind of thing you tell a stranger. I suppose you're not one now," he glanced up at her. "Not if you don't want me to be." She let the silence stretch. The air smelled of dry grass and the faint smoke of someone's chimney down the slope. "I stood up during a ladies' lecture," she said. "The speaker claimed women's brains were smaller, more delicate. I told her she was mistaking submission for softness." Orion's knife paused mid-slice. "She told my aunt I'd disrupted the order. My uncle said if I didn't learn restraint, I wouldn't find a place anywhere respectable." Orion set the knife down. "Sounds like they were threatened by something they didn't understand." Josephine looked over at him, eyes shadowed by the porch light. "You don't think I was just being difficult?" "I think difficult's another word for inconvenient when a woman tells the truth," he said. She stared at him for a long moment. "You have a way of saying things plain. I never saw much use in dressing up what's already clear." He stood then, slowly, and held out a hand. "Come walk with me." They passed the barn and the line of cottonwoods that marked the edge of the property. The moonlight caught in the silver tips of the grass, and somewhere a nightjar called low. Orion stopped near the fence line and rested his arms over the rail. Josephine mirrored him. "My father taught me how to read the land," he said. "Said you can't get to know a place unless you let it speak first." She smiled faintly. "And what does this land say? That it remembers everything." He tilted his head toward her. "You carry memory too, not just yours." She turned her face toward the open fields. Her voice was soft. "Sometimes I feel like I'm made more of echoes than anything else." He didn't respond right away. Then, "Maybe that's what makes your voice strong. You don't just speak, you carry what others were too afraid to say." Josephine's breath caught. Her hand found the top rail, fingers curling tight. Orion looked down at her hand, then back up. "You're not a burden here." She nodded once, jaw set. "I want to stay." "You already have." They stood there until the chill crept in, and still they didn't move. The wind stirred the grass like a river, and overhead the stars held steady. The wind shifted as April deepened, carrying the scent of creosote and warmed stone across the land. The days grew longer, the light stretching its reach over the ridgelines until late into the evening. Orion and Josephine fell into a rhythm that didn't need naming. He rose early to check the calves. She baked bread with her sleeves rolled to the elbows and her hair pinned loosely at the nape of her neck. They moved through the days with a quiet understanding, the kind that didn't require explanation. That afternoon, she found him near the spring-fed trough, mending a broken length of chain. Sweat clung to his neck, and the sun had deepened the lines around his eyes. She crossed the dry grass slowly, the hem of her skirt rustling against her boots. "Can I ask you something?" she said, stopping just short of the shade. He looked up, blinking against the light. "You've never needed permission before." She let that sit for a moment before answering. "Why haven't you asked more about me?" He set the chain aside and shrugged. "I figure folks tell what they're ready to. I don't need to know everything to trust someone." Her brow furrowed. "But what if I've done things you wouldn't agree with?" His eyes didn't waver. "Then I'd listen." She sat on the edge of the trough, hands folding in her lap. "I left a man behind in Boston. We weren't married, but it was expected. He worked for my father's firm, said I'd be safer if I stopped arguing in public. Orion picked up a stone and turned it over in his palm. You loved him. I thought I might, she said. Until I realized he only liked the quiet parts of me, the ones that didn't take up space. He tossed the stone gently into the dust. You ever think about going back? I used to, but not anymore. He stood then, brushing his hands on his trousers. I'm not him. I know. Her voice was steady. You haven't once asked me to be less. Orion stepped closer, not touching her, but near enough she could feel the warmth off his skin. I wouldn't know what to do with less. That night, she found a pair of boots tucked by the door, not new but clean and repaired her size. She ran her fingers over the stitching, then looked out the window where Orion was leading the horses toward the upper pasture. He didn't look back, just kept walking, his shoulders loose in the fading light. The next morning, she wore the boots to the creek where the soil turned rich and dark. She knelt, pressing her hands into the earth, and began turning it with the spade she'd found hanging by the shed. Orion watched from a distance before walking over, the brim of his hat shading his eyes. You planting something? He asked. Tomatoes, if I can keep the deer off them. Maybe beans. I need something to root. He crouched beside her, digging his fingers into the soil. Ground's good here, holds water better than most places. I thought I'd build a fence around the edge, nothing fancy, just enough to keep the animals out. I'll help. She glanced at him. You don't have to, I know. They worked in silence, sweat beading at their temples. By late morning, the first post stood upright, rough-hewn and sturdy. Josephine leaned against one and wiped her brow with the back of her wrist. Orion poured water into a dented tin cup and handed it to her. You always plan this far ahead. I didn't used to, she said, sipping slowly. But I'm not planning on leaving. His throat moved as he swallowed. Neither am I. She reached for his hand, calloused and warm. Do you want this to be something we build together? I already do. They didn't kiss then. They didn't need to. Later, when the sun dipped low and the fence stood finished, Josephine walked through the space she'd marked for the garden. Her steps were sure. Orion sat on the porch, watching her with the kind of gaze that didn't press or pry. She turned, caught his eye, and gave a small nod when he returned without a word. The house felt different that evening. Not fuller, but more lived in. Josephine set the kettle on the stove while Orion lit the lamp. Their shadows moved across the walls, not alone anymore, but side by side. That night, when the wind rose and dust whispered across the plains, Josephine lay awake listening to the creak of the rafters and the steady breath of the man beside her. I don't know what to call this, she said into the dark. He shifted, not groggy, just quiet. You don't have to name it. I want to. Her fingers found his. I want to give it roots, too. He squeezed her hand gently. Then call it ours. She closed her eyes. For the first time in her life, she didn't feel like she was taking up too much space. She felt like she'd come home. By early May, the cottonwoods along the creek had leafed out in full, their green heavy and rustling like water when the wind passed through. Josephine stood ankle-deep in the garden plot, brushing soil from her hands as Orion came up the slope with a bundle of fence wire across his back. That line near the east corner's sagging, he said, setting it down near the shed. Cattle'll test it if we don't fix it by week's end. Josephine shaded her eyes. I can come help after I finish setting the beans. He nodded once, then tilted his head toward the field. You've straightened every row. I don't like waste, she said, brushing her palms against her apron. Not of space or effort. He stepped closer, not quite touching her. You ever think about planting more than you need? I don't know if I've ever had more than I needed. Orion reached for the hoe she had leaned against the fence. Maybe it's time. A quiet passed between them, more thoughtful than still. She pressed the toe of her boot into the earth, watching how it held. "I had a letter from my cousin in St. Louis," she said at last. "She wants to know if I'm safe." He looked up from the tool. "Are you?" Josephine hesitated. "I'm not afraid, but I don't know if that counts." He laid the hoe across the fence rail. "It does." She folded her arms, eyes on the sky. "She said if I ever come back, I'd have to apologize. That I embarrassed everyone. You planning to write her back?" "I think I already did, just by staying here." Orion didn't reply, just reached out and brushed a strand of hair behind her ear. It wasn't a gesture he'd done before. That evening they didn't eat in the house. Josephine had taken to carrying food out beneath the cottonwood near the spring, saying the air tasted better there. Orion brought the plates, and she carried a folded blanket. They sat cross-legged, the bread still warm, the beans seasoned with dried sage she'd insisted was hiding at the back of the pantry. "Did you ever think you'd end up here?" she asked between bites. "With cows and cracked hands and a woman who plants in straight lines." He looked out toward the ridge. "Not exactly. I thought I'd be married to a man with a law office, 2 parlors, a piano I wasn't allowed to play." He set his tin plate aside. "You miss anything from that life?" Josephine pulled her knees up, wrapping her arms around them. "I miss knowing what came next, even if I hated it." Orion picked at a blade of grass. "You've got a say in what comes next now. I don't know how to build a life from scratch." "You're not starting from nothing," he said. "You've got your hands, your voice, me." She watched his face, the scar across his knuckle catching the last of the light. "You mean that?" "I wouldn't say it if I didn't." A breeze stirred the grass. Josephine reached for his hand, not lightly, but like she meant to keep it. He didn't move. "I want to make something with you," she said. "Not just survive." He looked at her then, long and sure. "Then let's make it." Later, by lamplight, she set a book on the table. The binding was worn, the corners soft from use. She opened it to a blank page and dipped the pen. "What are you writing?" he asked, coming in from the dark with a rag over his shoulder. She didn't look up. "A ledger. For the garden, for the fence, for what we build next." He leaned on the doorframe. "You're not planning to leave?" Josephine met his gaze. "I'm planning to stay, on purpose." He stepped forward then, slow and steady, and set one hand over hers. "Then I will too." They stood there as the wick burned low, ink drying on the page, the room filled with something quiet and sure. The house didn't feel like a holding place anymore. It felt like the beginning of something they could name. By the first weeks of June, the creek had slowed to a quiet trickle, and the garden rows stood firm with green bean vines curling upward, tomatoes beginning to flower. Josephine moved through the plot each morning, barefoot in the damp soil, inspecting leaves and checking for beetles. She wore a wide-brimmed straw hat now, one she'd found in the barn loft, dusty but still sound. Orion had trimmed and re-stitched the frayed edges without a word and left it on the table beside her tea the next morning. One afternoon, as clouds gathered low over the ridges, she sat on the porch with a basket of mending while Orion tied down the shutters. The air was close, heavy with the scent of rain that hadn't fallen yet. "Did you ever have a place like this growing up?" she asked without looking at him, her needle moving steady through a torn shirt cuff. "No," he said after a pause. "Spent most of it on the move. My father followed work logging, rail lines, whatever paid in coins or food. We never stayed long enough to plant anything." She nodded once, eyes on her thread. "That's why you know the land so well." "I learned early to read it faster than I could read people." Josephine set the shirt aside. "Would he have liked this place?" Orion leaned against the porch rail, arms crossed. "He wouldn't have understood it. He stayed ready to leave. I think standing still scared him." She considered that. "And you?" "I was tired of running before I was grown." The wind picked up then, rustling the branches overhead. Josephine tucked the mending under her arm and stood. Storm's coming. They moved inside, securing the windows, checking the hinges on the cellar door. When the rain finally came, it pounded hard and fast, a sudden release that rattled the tin roof and sent water sluicing from the eaves. They lit a lamp in the corner and sat by it, the room dim but warm. Josephine reached for the ledger on the shelf, flipping through the pages. "We've got enough put by to buy another milk cow if the garden holds." Orion leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "You thinking of adding to the herd?" "I'm thinking of trading the extra beans for cheese, maybe butter. There's a widow south of here who keeps Jersey cows." He nodded. "You've already made more of this place than I did in 5 years." She smiled without lifting her eyes. "You gave it room to wait." He reached for her hand then, and she let him, their fingers laced between them on the table. "Would you marry me?" he asked, voice low but steady. Josephine stilled. "You're not just asking because I've made a ledger and planted beans." "No," he said. "I'm asking because I can't picture a day without you in it." She looked at their hands, then into his face. "Yes." He let out a breath, and she leaned forward, pressing her forehead to his. "I don't want a preacher who'll make me promise to obey," she whispered. "Then we'll find one who lets you promise what's true," he said. "That you'll stay loud and I'll stay steady." The rain softened, tapping gentle against the glass. They married 2 weeks later, under the cottonwood near the spring. Mrs. Talbot, the midwife who kept to herself near the canyon rim, performed the ceremony. She wore her Sunday shawl and brought wildflowers wrapped in twine. Orion shaved and wore his best shirt, and Josephine stitched a new hem on her only blue dress. They exchanged vows with their eyes locked, hands clasped. No crowd, no music. Just the wind, the sky, and the hush of the land around them. Afterward, they shared bread and cold chicken under the tree, and Josephine gave Orion a narrow silver band she'd kept hidden in the bottom of her trunk. "It was my mother's," she said. "I thought I'd never have use for it." He turned it over in his palm, then slid it onto his finger. That night, they lay in bed with the windows open, the scent of sage drifting in, and Orion whispered something against her neck that made her laugh for the first time that day. They woke early the next morning and started the chores together, side by side, without ceremony. Years passed, and the house changed shape. They added a second room when the child came, a girl with her mother's mouth and her father's quiet gaze. Josephine taught her to read balance sheets and string beans on the same day. Orion built her a swing from cedar and hung it on the cottonwood limb. Neighbors came to call more often, not out of curiosity but respect. Josephine kept a shelf of ledgers, each one marked by year, and Orion tacked up a new fence each spring, expanding the pasture a little farther. They weathered dry spells, a brush fire that singed the edge of the north field, and a bad fever that took most of the hens one winter. Through it all, they held each other in the same way they always had, without question. Josephine never softened her voice. Orion never tried to. They grew older, slower, but never apart. At night they sat beneath the cottonwood where they'd wed, their hands still finding each other in the dusk, and every so often, when the wind was just right, Orion would say, "Laugh again, Joe," and she would. Not because she'd forgotten the world that once wanted her quiet, but because she'd built one that didn't.